If you ever work a job where you're the only person in a building after dark, pay attention to the moment you stop checking the locks. That's the moment something in you has decided you're safe. And that's exactly the moment I stopped being safe, even though I didn't understand that until it was almost too late to matter. I want to walk you through this slowly, because the order things happened in is the whole reason none of it felt like a big deal until it very suddenly was. I was 22 and working the overnight shift at a 24-hour pharmacy on the edge of a mostly residential part of town. Not a huge chain location, just a single standalone store that happened to stay open all night because of some contract with a nearby hospital that needed prescriptions filled at odd hours. Most nights it was just me and one other employee, a guy named Marcus, who worked the register up front, while I handled stock and occasional pharmacy support in the back. The job itself was about as unremarkable as jobs get. Restocking shelves, helping the rare customer who wandered in at 2 in the morning, watching the clock crawl towards sunrise. I liked the quiet of it, honestly. I'm not someone who's ever been bothered by being awake while the rest of the world sleeps. There's a stillness to those hours that I found almost peaceful, at least for the first several months I worked there. The store had a back door that led out to a small loading area where deliveries came in during the day. At night, that door stayed locked, obviously, but it had a small frosted window in it, just enough to let you see a vague shape if someone was standing close on the other side, without letting you make out any real detail. I want you to remember that window because it matters later. The first time anything felt off, it was a Tuesday night, somewhere around midnight. I was in the back stockroom organizing a shipment that had come in earlier that day, and I heard a knock on that back door. Not aggressive, just a couple of solid knocks. We didn't get deliveries at night, and nobody had any reason to be back there. So I walked over, a little confused, and looked through the frosted glass. I could make out a shape, roughly the size and height of an adult, standing maybe a foot back from the door. I called out and asked who it was and what they needed. No response. I waited a few seconds and asked again. Still nothing. Then the shape moved, slowly, and walked out of view of the window. I told Marcus about it when I went up front a few minutes later, and he laughed it off, said it was probably some drunk guy who'd wandered around back looking for a way in after finding the front locked, which would have made sense, except the front wasn't locked. We were open. There was no reason for anyone to go looking for a back entrance at all. That detail sat with me longer than I let on to Marcus that night, but I still managed to convince myself it was nothing by the time my shift ended. It happened again the following week. Same time, almost to the minute, another set of knocks on that same back door. This time I didn't bother asking who it was. I just watched through the frosted glass, and the shape was there again, standing in that same spot, not moving, not knocking again, just present. After maybe 10 seconds it turned and walked away, the same unhurried pace as before. I started dreading that part of the night after that. Not the whole shift, just that specific window of time, somewhere between midnight and 1, when I had started to expect, on some subconscious level, that the knocking might come. It didn't come again for almost 3 weeks, and I let myself relax during that stretch, the way you do when enough time passes that your nervous system decides the threat must have moved on. I was wrong about that, but I didn't know it yet. Here's where things shift from background unease into something I couldn't keep filing away as nothing. I came in for my shift on a Friday night, and Marcus mentioned, almost in passing while we were doing the register handoff, that one of the daytime employees had found something taped to the inside of the back door that morning when she came in to open up. A small piece of paper. He said it had just said something vague like, "See you soon." No name, nothing else. And the morning manager had assumed it was some kind of joke or prank from a former employee and thrown it away without thinking much of it. I asked Marcus if he'd seen it himself. He said no, he was just repeating what he'd been told. I asked if anyone had checked the security footage from that door to see who had taped it there. He said the camera covering that door had actually been malfunctioning for almost 2 weeks at that point, something about a loose connection that maintenance hadn't gotten around to fixing yet. I want you to sit with that combination for a second, the way I had to sit with it that whole shift. A note left on the one door whose camera happened to be broken. during a stretch of weeks when someone had already been quietly knocking on that exact door and walking away without explanation. None of that felt like coincidence to me, even though I had no way to prove otherwise. I asked our manager the next day to get that camera fixed as a priority, and to his credit, he did, within 48 hours. For about 2 weeks after that, nothing happened. No knocking, no notes, nothing on the now functioning camera feed. I started to think maybe getting the camera working again had been enough on its own to make whoever this was lose interest. The same way a porch light sometimes is enough to make someone think twice. Then on a Thursday night, close to 1 in the morning, I was in the stockroom when I heard the knock again. 3 solid knocks, same rhythm as always. My stomach dropped immediately because I knew, before I'd even looked, that the camera was working this time. Whoever this was had no idea, or didn't care, that they were finally being recorded. I looked through the frosted glass first, out of habit, and saw the familiar shape standing there. I didn't call out this time. I just backed away quietly and went to find Marcus, and together, we pulled up the live camera feed on the office computer. The footage showed a man, maybe in his 30s, dressed in dark clothes, standing directly in front of that door, completely still, looking up at the small frosted window as if he could somehow see through it, despite the glass being designed specifically to prevent that. He stood there for almost 2 full minutes without moving, without trying the handle, without doing anything except looking at that window. Then he slowly raised one hand and pressed it flat against the door, fingers spread, and held it there for several more seconds before finally turning and walking out of frame. Marcus called the police immediately, while I stood there staring at the frozen image of that handprint still fogging up faintly on the door's exterior glass from where his palm had been. When the police arrived about 15 minutes later, the man was long gone, but they pulled the footage themselves and said they'd run it to see if he matched anyone in their system. A few days later, an officer called the store to follow up and told our manager they'd identified the man through an unrelated case, someone with a pattern of approaching late-night businesses and leaving similar markers behind, never escalating to anything more than presence and small gestures like the one we'd captured, but enough of a pattern that they were actively building a case against him for a string of similar incidents at other locations across that side of the city. He was eventually picked up about 2 weeks after that, according to what our manager told us, though I never got more detail than that second-hand summary. The knocking stopped completely after that point. I worked there for another 8 months without a single repeat of it, but I never stopped checking that frosted window every single time I walked past that back door, regardless of whether I'd heard anything or not. I think about that handprint on the glass more than almost anything else from that job, because it wasn't aggressive. It wasn't an attempt to break in or threaten anyone directly. It was something quieter and somehow more unsettling than that. A kind of patient, deliberate presence that didn't need to do anything more than exist on the other side of a door to completely change how safe I felt inside a life. Building I had once considered the most boring, predictable place in my entire life. The second story took place at a different job a couple of years later, and it's one that still doesn't have a clean ending, which is part of why it stayed with me the way it has. I was working the night shift at a small regional call center that handled overnight customer service for a handful of different companies, mostly utility providers and a couple of insurance lines that needed coverage around the clock. The office itself was on the second floor of a building that otherwise sat completely empty after the businesses on the ground floor closed for the evening. There were maybe 6 or 7 of us working any given overnight shift, spread out across a large open floor of cubicles, headsets on, taking calls from people scattered across multiple time zones who had no idea how quiet and dim the room actually was on our end while we talked them through their billing issues. I'd been there about 5 months when the calls started. Not work calls, something separate, coming through on my desk phone's direct line rather than the queue system that routed customer calls to whoever was available. That direct line basically never rang unless it was a coworker reaching me from another part of the building, which almost never happened either, given how small our overnight crew was and how close together we all sat. The first time it rang, close to 2 in the morning, I picked it up assuming it was someone from another department. There was nothing on the other end except quiet breathing, slow and steady, for maybe 10 seconds, before the line went dead. I figured it was a misdial, some kind of phone system glitch, and didn't think much more of it. It rang again the following week. Same time, almost exactly 2 in the morning. Same quiet breathing, same silence otherwise. Same abrupt disconnection after several seconds. This time I mentioned it to one of my coworkers, a woman named Priya, who'd worked there longer than I had, and she said she'd had something similar happen to her a few months back, though she'd assumed at the time it was just a wrong number that kept reconnecting due to some carrier issue. I wanted to believe that explanation. I really did, but it kept happening, almost every week, always close to 2 in the morning, always that same pattern of breathing, followed by silence, followed by the call ending. I started recognizing the rhythm of it the way you'd recognize a song you'd heard too many times. This specific quality to the breathing that felt less like background noise and more like someone who knew they were being listened to and was, in some strange way, comfortable with that. About 6 weeks into this pattern, the calls started coming more frequently, twice a week, then 3 times, the timing still mostly centered around that same 2 in the morning window, but occasionally drifting earlier or later, by 20 or 30 minutes. I brought it up with my shift supervisor, who checked with IT, and they found nothing unusual in the call logs beyond confirming that yes, calls were definitely coming through on that direct line from an outside number that kept showing up as unavailable or restricted every single time, which meant there was no way to trace it back to an actual person without involving the phone carrier directly, which the company wasn't eager to pursue over what still technically amounted to a string of silent phone calls. The night everything became impossible to write off as a coincidence was a Wednesday. The call came in at its usual time, and I picked it up expecting the same pattern, the same breathing, the same silence. Instead, after about 5 seconds of that familiar quiet breathing, a voice spoke, low, calm, almost gentle in a way that made it somehow worse than if it had been aggressive. It said my name, not a guess, not something close to my name. My actual full name, first and last, spoken slowly, like the person on the other end wanted to make absolutely sure I understood they knew exactly who they were calling. I didn't say anything. I just sat there frozen with the headset pressed against my ear, and after a pause that felt endless, the voice said one more thing before the line went dead. It said, "You look tired tonight." I want you to understand what that sentence does to you when you're sitting in a mostly empty office on the second floor of a building at 2 in the morning, with no way of knowing whether someone outside that building, or worse, somewhere inside it, was actually looking at you as they said those words. I got up immediately and walked the entire floor with another coworker, checking every cubicle, every supply closet, every stairwell access door, anything that might explain how someone could have seen me well enough to comment on how tired I looked. We found nothing. Every exterior door was locked. Every window was sealed. There was no logical way for anyone to have actually been looking at me from anywhere in or immediately around that building. I reported the incident formally that night, and the company finally took it seriously enough to involve the phone carrier directly, given that the calls were now including a specific threat-adjacent comment rather than just silence. It took almost 2 weeks for the carrier to come back with anything, and what they eventually found was that the calls had been routed through a series of forwarding services specifically designed to mask the originating number, the kind of setup that suggested deliberate effort rather than some random wrong number glitch. The calls stopped entirely after that report went through, and I genuinely don't know whether that's because whoever was making them got spooked by the formal investigation, or simply moved on to some other target once this one had become more trouble than it was worth. I left that job about 4 months later, for reasons mostly unrelated to the calls themselves, though I won't pretend the lingering unease of those months didn't factor into how easily I said yes to a different opportunity when one came along. I never found out who it was. I never got an explanation for how they knew my name, or what they meant by that comment about how tired I looked, or whether they had actually been watching me somehow or simply guessing based on the late hour and the nature of the job. That unresolved piece is the part that has never fully settled for me. Some stories end with an arrest, or a name, or at least a theory that makes enough sense to let you put it down. This one just stopped, and I never got to know why. The last story happened at a gas station I worked at during a stretch of my early 20s, when I was juggling night shifts there alongside daytime classes, trying to get through a degree on a schedule that left almost no room for actual rest. The station sat just off a highway exit, the kind of place that mostly served truckers and travelers passing through at odd hours, with very little regular local traffic once it got late enough. I usually worked alone from 10 at night until 6 in the morning, which the company justified through a combination of bulletproof glass around the register and a panic button wired directly to local dispatch. I never thought much about either of those things until the night I actually needed them. It started, like most of these things seem to, with something small enough to dismiss. A car would pull into the lot, park near the edge away from the pumps, and just sit there with its engine off for 10 or 15 minutes before eventually pulling away without anyone getting out. I noticed it the first time purely by accident, glancing up from restocking the cigarette display behind the counter and catching the headlights cutting off in my peripheral vision. I didn't think anything of it. People sit in parking lots for all kinds of reasons, finishing phone calls, waiting on someone, just needing a minute before continuing a long drive. It happened again 2 nights later. Same general time, somewhere close to midnight, same behavior, parking at the edge of the lot, sitting with the engine off, eventually leaving without anyone coming inside. I started paying closer attention after that, not because I was scared yet, just because the pattern had become noticeable enough that my brain had started flagging it on its own, without me consciously deciding to track it. By the 4th or 5th occurrence, I had confirmed it was the same car every single time, a dark sedan I'd started to recognize by a small dent in the rear bumper. I mentioned it to the manager during a shift change, and he shrugged it off, said it was probably just someone who lived nearby and used our lot as a quiet spot to sit and unwind before going home, which is a completely reasonable thing for a manager to say and a completely unsatisfying thing to hear when you're the one alone in that building, every single night watching it happen. The night things actually escalated. The car pulled in at its usual time, but instead of staying parked at the edge of the lot, it pulled up directly in front of the store, close enough that the headlights briefly swept across the front windows before the engine cut off. I watched through the glass as the driver's door opened, and someone stepped out, walking toward the entrance with an unhurried, almost deliberate pace. He came inside, browsed for a minute or two near the snack aisle without picking anything up, and then approached the counter. He didn't buy anything. He just stood there for a moment, looking at me with an expression that was hard to read, somewhere between curious and amused, and then he asked what time I usually closed up and headed home. I told him the store didn't close, that it was open all night, trying to keep my voice steady and casual. He nodded slowly, like he already knew that, and had asked anyway just to see how I'd answer, and then he said something that has stuck with me word for word ever since. He said, "Must get lonely in here by yourself, especially this late." I gave some kind of non-committal answer, something about it being fine, and he just smiled, a slow, unhurried smile that didn't reach his eyes, and then turned and walked back out to his car. He sat in the lot for almost 20 more minutes after that conversation, before finally pulling away. I called the manager the next morning and told him everything: the repeated parking, the conversation, the specific comment about being alone. This time he took it more seriously, partly because I think hearing the actual words made it land differently than just hearing about a car sitting in a lot. He adjusted the schedule so that I'd have a second person scheduled with me for the late shifts going forward, at least for the next several weeks, and he reported the incident to local police, giving them what description I could provide along with the partial plate number I'd managed to catch through the window as the sedan pulled away. The car never came back to that lot again, at least not during any of my remaining shifts there, and I worked at that station for almost another year after that night. I never found out if the police ever identified him. Never heard anything further about it from my manager, beyond a brief mention that the report had been filed and logged. I think about that comment more than almost anything else from that entire job. Must get lonely in here by yourself, especially this late. Such a simple, almost casual thing to say, and yet it has never once stopped feeling like exactly what it was. A quiet, deliberate way of letting me know that he had been paying very close attention to exactly how alone I really was.